Welcome to Cap Nat Storyteller, your place for soothing stories to guide you into a peaceful night. If you enjoy these tales, please like and subscribe. It helps me share more calming stories with you and others. Drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's begin this relaxing journey together. Henry had always thought his late-night shifts at the software house were mundane. Debugging apps, tweaking codes, and occasionally grabbing coffee from the empty break room. But that night, as the clock ticked past 1 a.m., his monitor froze, displaying a strange error code he'd never seen before. "Help me. I see you." He dismissed it as a prank until the office lights began flickering, and a faint shadow darted across the room. Henry wasn't alone. Henry had always been the guy who stayed late at the software house, not because he loved his job, but because he had no choice. Bills piled up, rent was due, and as a junior developer, proving himself meant grinding through endless hours of debugging code and meeting deadlines. Tonight wasn't any different, at least, that's what he thought. It was just past midnight, and the office was eerily quiet. Rows of desks were illuminated only by the cold glow of monitors. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, creating a low hum that felt like static in his ears. Henry adjusted his chair and stretched, feeling the strain in his shoulders from hours of hunching over the keyboard. His screen displayed an app update log filled with red errors. Lines of code scrolled endlessly as he tried to locate the bug. His concentration was intense, but the silence in the room began to gnaw at him. He could almost hear his heartbeat echoing in his ears. "Focus, Henry," he thought, brushing off the creeping unease. Then, his monitor froze. The lines of code stopped mid-scroll, and a blinking cursor appeared on the screen. "What now?" he muttered, wiggling the mouse and hitting random keys to unfreeze it. The screen went black for a few seconds before displaying a new message in bold, red text. "Help me." Henry blinked, leaning in closer. The message wasn't part of the app he was working on. It wasn't a system error, either. "Is this some kind of prank?" he said aloud, half expecting one of his coworkers to pop out laughing. But the office was empty, and the silence was suffocating. Before he could think further, the text on the screen changed. "I see you." His breath hitched. The message seemed personal. His palms grew clammy as he scanned the room, his eyes darting to every shadow and corner. "All right, very funny," he called out, his voice shaky. "Whoever's doing this, you got me. Now stop messing around." No response. The overhead lights flickered briefly, and a cold draft swept through the room. Henry stood, rubbing his arms against the sudden chill. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. He snatched it up, eager for any distraction. It was a notification from an unknown number. The message read, "Don't turn around." A shiver ran down his spine. His mouth went dry as he resisted the urge to look behind him. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on him. "Okay, who's doing this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint sound, like fingernails tapping against glass. The sound came from the large window behind him. Henry's stomach churned. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe steadily. Slowly, he turned around. The blinds were drawn, but there was a faint outline of something on the other side of the glass. A face. Or at least, it resembled one. The features were indistinct, as if smeared like wet paint. He stumbled backward, his chair rolling away with a squeal. The tapping stopped, but the shape lingered, motionless. Grabbing his phone, Henry turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the window. The beam reflected off the glass, but there was nothing there. The figure had vanished. Henry exhaled shakily, convincing himself it was a trick of his tired mind. He returned to his desk, but his screen had changed again. This time, it displayed a live feed of the office. The camera angle was strange, as though it was being filmed from above. "What the hell?" Henry muttered. The feed showed the rows of empty desks, the glow of abandoned monitors, and the dimly lit break room in the distance. Nothing unusual. But then, the camera shifted, zooming in on his own desk. Henry's blood ran cold. "Is this some kind of hack?" he whispered, frantically checking the system logs. The camera feed moved again, this time panning to the hallway behind him. At first, it was empty. Then, a shadow moved across the frame, its shape flickering like static. Henry whipped around, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The hallway was empty. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "You're not alone." The air in the room felt suffocating, and the hum of the lights seemed louder, almost deafening. Henry grabbed his bag, deciding he'd had enough. He wasn't staying a minute longer. As he approached the elevator, the motion sensor lights flickered on, illuminating the hallway in harsh, intermittent bursts. Each flash seemed slower than the last, casting long, warped shadows across the walls. He pressed the elevator button repeatedly, his fingers trembling. The doors finally slid open, but the inside was dark. Hesitating for only a moment, Henry stepped in. The doors closed, and the elevator descended. But instead of the usual mechanical hum, the sound was distorted, like a warped recording. The lights inside flickered erratically, and the elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors didn't open. Come on," Henry muttered, hitting the emergency button. The light inside the elevator dimmed until it was nearly pitch black. Then, a faint glow appeared on the wall in front of him. It was another message, scrawled in dripping red letters. "You can't escape." Henry's breath quickened as the elevator jolted violently. The doors creaked open, revealing a hallway that didn't belong in the building. The walls were lined with rusted lockers, and the floor was stained with dark, unidentifiable smears. The faint sound of distant footsteps echoed, growing louder with each passing second. Henry stepped out cautiously, his phone's flashlight barely illuminating the oppressive darkness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. From somewhere behind him, a voice whispered his name. "Henry." He turned, his flashlight beam trembling as it landed on a figure at the end of the hallway. Its face was pale, featureless, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The figure started moving toward him, its steps jerky and unnatural. Henry froze, paralyzed by fear. "Stay back," he shouted, but the figure didn't stop. As it reached out a hand, the lights flickered violently, and the hallway was plunged into darkness. Henry's scream echoed, swallowed by the void. When Henry's scream faded into the suffocating darkness, he found himself gasping for breath, heart pounding as if it were about to burst. His phone's flashlight flickered weakly, barely cutting through the oppressive black. The figure that had loomed at the end of the hallway was gone, or so it seemed. Henry stumbled backward, his legs shaky and unsteady. His mind raced. Was this a prank? A nightmare? None of it felt real, but the icy cold sweat dripping down his back told him otherwise. The hallway stretched ahead, long and silent, its walls cracked and discolored as though abandoned for decades. The faint scent of mold and decay hung in the air, making his stomach churn. His instinct was to run, but where? He had no idea where he was, no way to call for help. The sound of faint breathing broke the silence. It wasn't his. Henry froze, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The sound was close, too close. Turning slowly, he aimed the weak beam down the hallway. It illuminated nothing but empty lockers and endless shadows. Then came the whisper. "Henry." It was soft, chillingly intimate, as though the voice was right by his ear. He spun around, the flashlight beam dancing wildly. "And no. Stay away," he shouted, his voice echoing down the corridor. The reply came, raspy and taunting, "You shouldn't have stayed." Henry's breathing grew erratic. The voice didn't belong to anyone he knew, and its tone dripped with malice. His survival instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he bolted, his footsteps echoing loudly in the corridor. The hallway seemed endless, stretching farther with each step. The lockers on either side blurred into a dark smear as he ran. But no matter how far he went, the whispers followed. "Henry." The voice was closer now, its tone more insistent. His phone's flashlight dimmed, sputtering before going out completely. Panic surged through him. He fumbled with the buttons, but the screen remained black. The only light came from faint red emergency signs mounted at intervals along the ceiling, casting an eerie, pulsating glow. As he rounded a corner, Henry skidded to a halt. The corridor ahead was blocked by a solid wall. It hadn't been there a second ago, he was sure of it. His chest heaved as he turned to retrace his steps, but the hallway behind him was gone, replaced by another wall. What's happening?" he stammered, pressing his hands against the cold, damp surface. A low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere above him. His head snapped upward, and his stomach dropped. The figure was crawling on the ceiling, its limbs bent at impossible angles, its head twisted completely backward to face him. Its eyes, or the black, empty voids where eyes should have been, locked onto his. Henry backed away, his legs trembling so badly he nearly collapsed. "Stay back," he shouted again, his voice hoarse. The figure's lips stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice a haunting mix of mockery and hunger. It began crawling toward him, its movements jerky and insect-like. Each step produced a sickening crunch, like bones breaking and resetting. Henry had nowhere to go. The walls boxed him in, the creature closing the distance with horrifying speed. Desperation took over. He grabbed his phone and hurled it at the figure. It struck its chest with a dull thud but had no effect. The creature paused, tilting its head as if amused. Then, it opened its mouth impossibly wide, emitting a deafening screech that made Henry's ears ring. Suddenly, the floor beneath him gave way. Henry plunged into darkness, his body weightless as he fell. The air rushed past him, cold and biting, until he hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. Pain shot through his body, but he was alive. He groaned, trying to push himself up. The room he landed in was dimly lit by a flickering bulb hanging from a frayed wire. The walls were lined with broken monitors, their screens cracked but still flickering faintly. Each screen displayed distorted images of Henry's office, his desk, the break room, the hallway. "What is this?" he whispered, crawling toward one of the monitors. The image on the screen shifted to show him, exactly as he was, lying on the floor, staring into the monitor. His heart skipped a beat. The screen flickered again, and now the figure was there, standing behind him. Henry spun around, but the room was empty. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice trembling. "This isn't real. It can't be real." The sound of footsteps echoed above him, heavy and deliberate. The figure was still moving, searching for him. He needed to find a way out. Ignoring the pain in his limbs, Henry scrambled to his feet and scanned the room. There was a door at the far end, partially ajar, leading into another shadowy corridor. Summoning every ounce of courage, he bolted for the door. The monitors crackled behind him, displaying the creature's distorted grin. The corridor beyond was narrow and suffocating, its walls pulsating as though alive. Henry's breath hitched as he pressed forward, the air thick and foul. The whispers had returned, this time louder and overlapping, a cacophony of voices that made his head spin. "Turn around," they chanted. "Turn around, Henry." He refused, his feet pounding against the uneven floor. The corridor twisted and turned, leading him deeper into an impossible maze. His legs ached, and his lungs burned, but he couldn't stop. Then he saw it, a faint light ahead. It was weak, but it was the first sign of hope he'd had all night. Henry pushed himself harder, his heart racing as he reached the light. It was coming from a small room, the doorway lined with strange symbols carved into the wood. He hesitated, the whispers growing louder behind him. With no other choice, he stepped inside. The room was small and circular, its walls covered in jagged markings that seemed to glow faintly. In the center of the room stood a large, cracked mirror. The surface was cloudy, as though something was trapped beneath the glass. Henry approached cautiously, his reflection distorted and shifting. "What is this place?" he whispered, reaching out to touch the mirror. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the whispers stopped. Silence filled the room, oppressive and absolute. Then, the reflection in the mirror smiled. It wasn't him. Henry's distorted reflection smiled at him, but it wasn't the kind of smile that brought comfort. It was malicious, a grin that stretched wider than his face should allow. His heart pounded as he stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The room seemed to tighten around him, the walls pulsating faintly as if alive. The markings etched into the surface began to glow brighter, casting strange shadows that danced across the room. What do you want from me?" Henry stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The reflection tilted its head, mimicking the creature he had seen crawling on the ceiling. Its lips parted, but instead of speaking, it let out a low, guttural laugh. Then, the room changed. The walls began to ripple, and the symbols twisted into new shapes, ones Henry couldn't recognize but instinctively knew were dangerous. A cold wind swept through the room, despite there being no windows or vents. The mirror's surface shimmered like water, and the image of his twisted reflection dissolved. In its place, scenes began to play out. Henry saw himself in his office, sitting at his desk, coding like he had countless nights before. But something was wrong. The camera angle shifted, showing the shadowed figure standing directly behind him, its void-like eyes locked on the back of his head. "This isn't real," he whispered, shaking his head. The reflection in the mirror turned to face him directly. It wasn't just mimicking him anymore, it had taken on a life of its own. Its mouth moved, and this time, words came through. "You were warned," it said, its voice layered with multiple tones. "Warned about what?" Henry demanded, his desperation overtaking his fear. The reflection's grin widened, its eyes narrowing. "The code wasn't broken, Henry. You were." The statement hit him like a physical blow. His mind raced to make sense of it. He'd been debugging the app for weeks. The issues started small, random crashes, inexplicable errors. But in the last few days, the problems had become sinister. Lines of code he didn't remember writing appeared in the app, strange commands that seemed to reference him directly. "What do you mean?" Henry shouted at the reflection. The mirror flickered again, and the scene shifted. This time, it showed him back in his apartment. He was sitting on his couch, his laptop open on the coffee table. The light from the screen illuminated his tired face as he worked late into the night. Behind him, the shadow appeared again. It lingered, its hand outstretched, hovering inches away from his shoulder. But then the scene darkened, and Henry's scream was the only source of light. The shadow's hand reached out and touched him. The Henry in the reflection froze, his head snapping up as if hearing something. Slowly, he turned, and the shadow engulfed him. The mirror went black. Henry stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No. No. That didn't happen. That's not real." The reflection reappeared, its grin now impossibly wide, splitting its face. "It is real, Henry. And it's far from over." Before he could respond, the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, shards flying outward like jagged missiles. Henry threw his arms up to protect his face, but the pieces never reached him. Instead, they hung in the air, suspended as if caught in an invisible web. Then they began to move, assembling themselves into a new shape, a doorway. The jagged edges glowed faintly, and beyond the frame was a swirling darkness, alive and pulsating like the walls. "No," Henry said, shaking his head. "I'm not going through that. No way." The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't coming from the room anymore, they were coming from the doorway. "Henry. Come. Join us." The voices overlapped, each one more menacing than the last. The pull of the doorway was almost tangible, an invisible force dragging him forward. He fought against it, digging his heels into the ground, but the pull grew stronger. His feet slid across the floor as if the room itself was tilting toward the portal. "Stop," he shouted, but the voices only laughed. Just as he was about to be consumed by the darkness, a new sound broke through the cacophony, a soft chime, like a notification ping from his phone. The pull stopped abruptly, and Henry fell to the floor, gasping for breath. His phone. It was lying on the ground where he had dropped it earlier. The screen was cracked, but it glowed faintly, displaying a single message. "Run." Henry didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed the phone, and bolted for the doorway. Despite the terror it represented, it was the only way out. As he stepped through, the darkness enveloped him completely. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no light, just an endless void. Then, he was falling again. This time, the landing was softer, but the disorientation was worse. He blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the dim light. He was back in the office. Or at least, it looked like the office. The layout was the same, but everything was wrong. The walls were warped, the desks covered in dust and cobwebs. The monitors flickered with static, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Henry stood, his legs trembling. He looked around, his heart sinking as he realized he wasn't alone. The shadowy figure was there, standing at the far end of the room. But this time, it wasn't alone. Dozens of others stood beside it, their forms twisted and indistinct, their faces a blur of anguish and malice. Henry's phone buzzed again. "Keep running." The figures began to move, their footsteps echoing like thunder in the hollow space. Henry turned and ran, the sounds of their pursuit filling his ears. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing: stopping wasn't an option. Henry's breaths came in ragged gasps as he sprinted down the warped, decaying office corridors. The shadows behind him multiplied, their footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. The air felt heavier with every step, thick with the pungent smell of mildew and something metallic, like blood. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch and twist as though it had no end, bending impossibly like a snake coiling around him. Walls appeared to close in, their surfaces pulsating with faint, eerie symbols that shifted when he tried to focus on them. Henry didn't stop running. He couldn't. The figures behind him were relentless, their distorted voices filling the air with low growls and murmurs. "Stay with us. You can't escape. We see you, Henry." Their words sent shivers down his spine. Each voice seemed to latch onto a deeper fear, an unspoken dread he couldn't shake. As he rounded a corner, his foot snagged on something, sending him sprawling to the ground. He groaned in pain, pushing himself up quickly, but his eyes locked onto what had tripped him, a human hand protruding from the floor, frozen in a grotesque grasping motion. Henry scrambled back, his heart pounding. The hand was pale, lifeless, and unnaturally thin, its fingers twisted as though they had been broken. The floor beneath it began to ripple, and more hands started to emerge, clawing at the air. "No, no, no," Henry muttered, backing away. He turned and bolted down another hallway, but the hands followed, bursting from the walls and floor around him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their pulsating rhythm matching the frantic beat of his heart. Just when he thought the hallway would never end, he stumbled into a new space, a massive, dimly lit room filled with towering shelves that stretched high into the shadows above. Each shelf was lined with old, dusty filing cabinets, their labels faded and illegible. The silence was deafening, broken only by his ragged breathing. "What is this place?" Henry whispered to himself, his voice trembling. The room felt endless, the rows of cabinets forming a labyrinth. He stepped forward cautiously, the floor creaking under his weight. The air was colder here, and the faint scent of burning paper lingered. As he moved deeper into the room, a faint sound reached his ears, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on metal. Tap. 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 It was slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere within the maze of cabinets. Henry's pulse quickened as he tried to pinpoint the source. He took another step forward, but the sound moved, now echoing from behind him. He turned sharply, the flashlight on his phone illuminating only empty shelves and rows of cabinets. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing. The tapping stopped. The silence returned, but it was heavier now, pressing down on him like a weight. He felt as though he were being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Suddenly, one of the cabinets nearby slid open with a loud screech, making him jump. A thick, black mist poured out, coiling like smoke. It hovered for a moment before dissipating, revealing a single sheet of paper fluttering to the ground. Henry hesitated before picking it up, his fingers trembling. The paper was yellowed and brittle, covered in strange, jagged symbols similar to the ones on the walls earlier. But in the center of the page, written in bold, red letters, was a single phrase. "You brought this upon yourself." Henry's stomach churned. He didn't understand the message, but its accusatory tone filled him with dread. Before he could think further, another cabinet slid open, then another, and another. Black mist poured from them all, flooding the room with an icy coldness that seeped into his bones. The tapping sound returned, louder and faster, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made his skin crawl. "Henry." The voice was deep, resonant, and filled with malice. It echoed through the room, coming from every direction. Henry spun around, his flashlight barely cutting through the encroaching darkness. The mist began to coalesce, forming vague humanoid shapes that moved toward him. Their faces were featureless, but their presence radiated pure hatred. He backed away, clutching the paper tightly. "Stay back. I didn't do anything." The figures didn't stop. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, their limbs bending and twisting as though they were made of liquid. Henry turned and ran deeper into the maze of cabinets, his footsteps echoing like thunder. The whispers and growls followed him, growing louder with every step. He turned corner after corner, but the rows of cabinets seemed endless. It felt as though he were running in circles, the layout shifting and changing behind him. Then he saw it, a faint light glowing at the end of one aisle. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward it, his legs burning from the effort. The light grew brighter, revealing an old wooden door standing alone amidst the towering shelves. It was carved with intricate patterns and symbols, similar to the ones he had seen earlier, but these glowed with a faint blue light. The whispers intensified as he reached the door, the shadowy figures closing in behind him. Henry grabbed the handle and twisted it, throwing the door open and diving through without looking back. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the sounds of the pursuing shadows. Henry found himself in a small, dimly lit room. A single desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with old papers, photographs, and a flickering lamp. His breathing slowed as he approached the desk, his eyes scanning the scattered items. Among them was a photograph that caught his attention. It was of him. Henry's hands trembled as he picked it up. The photo showed him sitting at his desk in the office, working late at night. But in the background, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure. Its empty eyes stared directly at the camera. Beneath the photograph was another sheet of paper, this one blank except for a single line written in bold, black letters. "It's not just watching." It's waiting. The room suddenly felt colder. Henry turned, expecting to see another shadow, but the room was empty. Or so he thought. The lamp flickered, and for a split second, he saw a reflection in its glass, a face grinning back at him. The light went out. Henry stood frozen in the pitch-black room, his pulse hammering in his ears. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was oppressive, alive. It pressed against his skin, suffocating him. The faint grin he'd seen in the lamp's reflection lingered in his mind, a cruel, mocking reminder that he wasn't alone. His phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. The soft glow of its cracked screen illuminated his trembling hands as he pulled it out. A new message blinked on the screen. "Don't move." Henry's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the warning felt undeniable, as if moving would trigger something far worse than what was already lurking. In the suffocating silence, faint whispers began to emerge, not the aggressive ones from before, but quieter, almost conversational. They floated around him, overlapping like threads of a frayed tapestry. He doesn't know yet. It's too late. Should have stayed away. Henry clamped a hand over his mouth to muffle his breathing. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint where the whispers were coming from, but they seemed to seep out of the very walls. Suddenly, the room shifted. The floor beneath him rippled like water, and the walls seemed to expand and contract, breathing with a sinister rhythm. The desk and its scattered items dissolved into the darkness, leaving him standing in an empty void. Then, faint figures began to materialize. At first, they were just outlines, ghostly and translucent. But as they moved closer, their forms solidified. They were humanoid, but wrong, elongated limbs, heads cocked at unnatural angles, their features obscured by an impenetrable shadow. Henry's phone buzzed again, the faint chime like a lifeline in the abyss. "Don't look at them." Panic surged through him as the figures inched closer. Their movements were unnervingly slow, deliberate, as though savoring his fear. Henry squeezed his eyes shut, his heart hammering so loudly he feared it might give him away. The whispers grew louder. "He's seen us. Can't leave now. Watching, always watching." A cold breath brushed against his neck, sending a jolt of terror through his body. Something was standing directly behind him. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of nails dragging across the floor filled the room. Henry's entire body tensed as the presence loomed closer, its cold, rancid breath lingering just above his shoulder. And then, the voice spoke, low, guttural, and impossibly close. "Do you think you can hide, Henry?" He couldn't stop himself. His eyes shot open. The room was no longer empty. Dozens of figures surrounded him, their hollow eyes locked on his every movement. Their faces were twisted masks of anguish and hatred, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. The silent ones. Henry stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The figures didn't move, but their stares burned into him, each one radiating an unbearable sense of malice. The floor beneath him shifted again, and he felt himself being dragged backward. He clawed at the ground, but his hands passed through it as though it weren't solid. "No!" he screamed, his voice echoing into the void. The silent ones didn't respond. They merely watched as he was pulled away, their expressions unchanged. The darkness swallowed him whole. When Henry awoke, he was lying on a cold, hard surface. The air was damp and carried the faint scent of earth and decay. He opened his eyes to find himself in a narrow tunnel, its walls lined with jagged rocks that seemed to pulse faintly, like veins carrying blood. A faint light flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. "Where am I now?" Henry muttered, his voice trembling. As he got to his feet, the sound of soft shuffling reached his ears. He froze, straining to locate the source. The shuffling grew louder, accompanied by a faint, irregular tapping. Tap, SHFF, tap. It was coming closer. Henry turned and ran, the tunnel seeming to stretch endlessly before him. The tapping and shuffling followed, growing louder with every step. His phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, its faint light illuminating a new message. Stop running. Confusion and terror warred within him. Why would he stop? Whatever was behind him was getting closer. But the messages had kept him alive so far. With a deep, shaky breath, Henry skidded to a halt. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing echoing through the tunnel. The silence stretched on, oppressive and unnerving. And then, from the darkness ahead, a figure emerged. It was different from the silent ones. This figure was taller, its body impossibly thin and elongated. Its head was smooth, featureless, but its presence radiated a primal, bone-deep fear that made Henry's legs feel like jelly. The figure raised a long, spindly arm, pointing directly at him. "Henry," it said, its voice echoing as though spoken from a great distance. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure began to approach, its movements unnervingly fluid, as though it were gliding rather than walking. Henry's phone buzzed again. "Turn around." He hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to run forward, away from the figure, but the message felt undeniable. With a trembling breath, he turned. Behind him, the tunnel had changed. The walls were no longer jagged rock but smooth, polished surfaces etched with glowing symbols. At the far end, a door stood ajar, a faint light spilling out. Henry didn't need another message. He bolted toward the door, the tapping and shuffling resuming behind him. As he reached the doorway, he felt the air shift, the oppressive presence growing stronger. He threw himself through the opening and slammed the door shut behind him. The silence was deafening. He turned to find himself in another room, this one bathed in a cold, blue light. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a small, black box. The box seemed to hum with energy, its surface etched with the same symbols that had followed him throughout his ordeal. His phone buzzed one last time. "It's your choice now." Henry stared at the box, dread pooling in his stomach. He didn't know what opening it would do, but he knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, there was no turning back. The cold blue light emanating from the room made Henry's skin crawl. The black box on the pedestal stood there like a forbidden artifact, radiating an unsettling energy that seemed to fill the room with a low hum. The symbols etched into its surface glowed faintly, pulsating in a slow rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Henry wiped his clammy palms on his jeans, his eyes darting to the door he had just slammed shut. It was seamless now, as though it had never existed. There was no going back. His phone buzzed again. He hesitated before looking, fearing what it might say. "Open it." His breath hitched. The very thought of touching the box sent waves of nausea rolling through him. But as he stood there, frozen, another line of text appeared on the screen. "Or they will come." A faint scratching noise broke the silence, sending a chill down his spine. It was soft at first, like fingernails on glass, but it quickly grew louder, more desperate. Henry turned toward the walls. The smooth surfaces were shifting, the glowing symbols bleeding into one another as if they were alive. Dark shapes began to press against the walls from the other side, their outlines grotesque and inhuman. The scratching grew into a cacophony of screeches and groans, the walls bulging as though whatever was behind them was forcing its way through. Panic surged through him. He had no choice. Henry took a hesitant step toward the pedestal, his legs feeling like lead. The air around the box grew colder with every step, his breath visible in the icy atmosphere. When he finally reached it, his hands hovered over the box, trembling. The symbols on the box flared brighter, casting jagged shadows that danced wildly around the room. He could feel the hum reverberating through his bones now, a deep, otherworldly vibration. Taking a deep breath, he placed his hands on the box. The surface was cold and unnervingly smooth, almost like glass. As soon as his fingers made contact, the humming stopped. The room plunged into complete silence. For a moment, Henry thought everything had stopped. The scratching, the shadows pressing against the walls, even the oppressive energy, it all disappeared. But then the box began to shift under his hands. The lid slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a swirling black void inside. It wasn't empty, it was alive, moving and writhing like a pit of snakes. Tendrils of darkness reached out, curling around his fingers, pulling him closer. A voice echoed in his mind, deep and commanding, bypassing his ears entirely. The choice is made. Henry tried to pull his hands away, but they were stuck, anchored to the box by the tendrils. Panic overtook him as the room began to transform. The walls crumbled away, revealing an endless expanse of darkness filled with faint, glowing eyes watching him from every direction. The floor beneath him disintegrated, and he found himself suspended in the void, the box now floating in front of him. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice swallowed by the darkness. The voice in his head returned, colder and more menacing. "You have unleashed what was hidden. Now you must pay the price." The tendrils wrapped around his arms, pulling him closer to the box. Images flooded his mind, his office, his co-workers, late nights hunched over his laptop. The figure he had seen in the photographs, always lurking just out of sight. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. It was him, sitting at his desk, but his reflection in the computer screen wasn't his own. It was the shadowy figure, grinning maliciously. The voice spoke again. "IT has always been watching." Henry screamed, thrashing against the tendrils, but it was no use. The box pulled him closer until his face was mere inches from the swirling void. The darkness erupted, enveloping him completely. When Henry opened his eyes, he was back in his office. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above him, and the hum of distant conversations filled the air. He blinked, disoriented, his heart still racing. Everything looked normal. His desk was cluttered with papers and coffee cups, and his laptop screen displayed lines of code. Had it all been a dream? He rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, trying to steady his breathing. The nightmare had felt so real, the shadows, the whispers, the box. As he stared at his laptop, something caught his eye. A file was open on his screen, one he didn't recognize. Its name was simple, Watched. His stomach sank. He clicked on the file, his hand trembling. The screen flickered, and the file opened to reveal a single sentence. "You can never leave." Henry's computer screen went black, and in its reflection, he saw the figure standing behind him. The office lights flickered, and the whispers began again. The whispers grew louder, reverberating around the office like a symphony of torment. Henry sat frozen in his chair, unable to tear his eyes away from the black computer screen. The reflection was unmistakable, the shadowy figure stood behind him, its twisted grin spreading unnaturally wide, teeth gleaming in the faint light. "Henry," the voice was a guttural rasp, as if dragged up from the depths of something ancient and unspeakable. Henry's chest tightened. His breathing quickened, the sound merging with the whispers, which now seemed to echo inside his head. He bolted upright, spinning around to confront whatever was behind him. The office was empty. Rows of cubicles stretched endlessly, the fluorescent lights above flickering sporadically. The faint sound of keyboards and distant conversations had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. "Hello?" Henry called out, his voice cracking. No response. His phone buzzed again, and he almost dropped it in his haste to read the message. "It's not over." The phone screen flickered, and a new message appeared beneath the first. "Run." Without hesitation, Henry bolted toward the nearest exit. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the sound was being warped and twisted. The hallway stretched longer and longer with each step, the exit door shrinking into the distance like a cruel mirage. Behind him, the whispers grew louder, taking on a sinister edge. "He's ours now. No escape. It's feeding." Henry choked back a scream, his legs burning as he pushed himself harder. The air grew colder, the darkness closing in around him. The hallway seemed alive, its walls shifting and writhing like a living organism. Finally, he reached the door, slamming his shoulder into it. The heavy metal gave way, and he stumbled into the stairwell. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed ominously, but Henry didn't stop to look back. He began to descend the stairs, his heart pounding. The narrow stairwell was lit by a single, flickering bulb that cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls. Each step echoed like a gunshot, the sound unnervingly distorted. And then he heard it, the faint tapping sound from before, growing louder with each passing second. Tap, SHFF, tap. It was coming from above. Henry quickened his pace, skipping steps in his desperation to escape. The tapping followed, relentless and deliberate. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't dare stop to read the message. As he rounded the next flight of stairs, he froze. The figure was standing there, blocking the path. Its elongated limbs twitched unnaturally, and its featureless face turned toward him, as though sensing his fear. Henry staggered back, nearly losing his balance. The tapping ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. The figure began to move, its movements impossibly fluid, almost like it was gliding. Henry turned and sprinted back up the stairs, his lungs burning. He didn't care where he was going, he just needed to get away. But as he climbed, the stairwell seemed to loop endlessly. No matter how far he went, he always ended up back at the same landing. The whispers returned, louder and more aggressive. You can't run. It's watching. You belong here. Henry screamed in frustration, slamming his fists against the walls. The figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs, its grotesque form stretching as it began to ascend. Desperation clawed at him as he pulled his phone from his pocket, hoping for some sort of guidance. The screen flickered to life, displaying a single word. Jump. He stared at the message, disbelief and terror warring within him. Jump? Into what? The figure was closer now, its elongated arms reaching out as if to grab him. Henry glanced over the railing, the abyss below seeming to stretch endlessly. His phone buzzed again. Now. Tears streamed down his face as he climbed onto the railing, his legs trembling. The figure let out a low, guttural growl, its movements becoming frenzied. I don't want to die. Henry shouted, his voice echoing into the void. Another buzz. It's the only way. With a final, shuddering breath, Henry closed his eyes and let himself fall. When he opened his eyes, he was back at his desk. The office was alive with the sound of keyboards clicking and phones ringing. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Henry sat there, breathing heavily, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it all a hallucination? Hey, Henry. The voice made him jump. He turned to see Lucas, one of his co-workers, standing beside him with a cup of coffee. Lucas frowned. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Henry forced a weak laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, just tired, I guess. Lucas shrugged and walked away, but as Henry watched him leave, something caught his eye. Lucas's reflection in the office window wasn't his own. It was the figure. Henry's blood turned to ice as the reflection turned its head toward him, its grin spreading wider and wider. The lights in the office flickered. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. It's not done. Never over. He's trapped. Henry's phone buzzed one last time. With trembling hands, he lifted it to read the message. Welcome back. The screen went black, and this time, it stayed that way. Maya stood frozen in front of her front door, the key missing, her heart pounding as she tried to shake off the dread clawing at her chest. She knocked once, twice, nothing. But then, a sound from inside. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. She pressed her ear against the cold wood, breath shallow, trying to catch a glimpse of her mom, trying to make sense of it all. And then, from the other side, came a voice, her own. Maya. But Maya hadn't spoken. Her blood ran cold. Who was in there? And why was her voice calling her? Maya had always hated the silence of the house, but tonight, it was suffocating. The night air hung thick with an unshakable tension, as if something was wrong in the very bones of the place. She stood there, outside her front door, hand trembling as she gripped the worn handle. Her mother, normally so responsive, had been oddly absent when Maya had knocked. It was unlike her, and something about it gnawed at the edges of Maya's nerves. The rustling from inside had been unmistakable, but there was no movement on the other side of the door. No reply. Maya swallowed hard, her mind racing with thoughts of what could possibly be happening. Was her mom okay? Was she asleep? Could she have fainted again, like last time? Mama? Maya called again, her voice cracking at the end of the word. This time, her voice broke through the quiet, the echo of her own fear creeping back into her thoughts. Nothing. The house was quiet once more, but the silence now felt heavy, like something was hiding within it. Maya's hand tightened around the handle, the cold metal biting into her palm. She pulled at it again, desperately, but it didn't budge. The lock, of course. Her mom must have locked it from the inside. Maybe she didn't hear Maya knocking, maybe she was in a deep sleep. But why hadn't she answered? The unease in her chest swelled, making it hard to breathe. Something wasn't right. Maya stepped back, looking at the window to her left, the only source of light in the darkness. She could see a faint glow from the inside, a flicker of movement, as if something was shifting behind the curtains. But when she squinted, all she saw was black. Her heart rate quickened. The footsteps she'd heard before weren't her mom's. They had been too slow, too deliberate. Not the kind of movement someone makes when they're simply adjusting in bed. They were purposeful. Maya's thoughts raced back to the odd feeling she'd had earlier, on her walk home from the diner. The air had felt wrong. It had clung to her skin, heavy with an unspoken warning, like the entire world was holding its breath. She had dismissed it, but now, standing outside the door, it all clicked. The unease. The whispers. The hollow voice that hadn't been hers. She was about to knock again, but stopped. Her hand froze mid-air as a soft whisper, faint, but clear, slithered from the crack under the door. Maya. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. This time, she heard it clearly. The voice, her voice, was distorted, hollow, as if it had been stretched thin across time. Maya's blood ran cold. She should have run, should have screamed for help, but she couldn't move. She was rooted in place, as if the very air had turned to stone. The door felt like it was pulling her in, like it was alive, breathing in the space around her. Maya took a shaky step back, her mind screaming at her to leave, to run, to do anything but stand here. But the voice, her voice, was still there. Maya. She could feel it now, deep in her bones. It wasn't her mother's voice. It wasn't even really her own. It was something else. Something far worse. Something that had been waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest, every instinct telling her to flee, but her feet remained stuck to the ground. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the whisper stopped. And then, silence. The silence was deafening. The kind of silence that feels like the weight of the world pressing in from all sides, suffocating, choking the life out of everything. The faint glow from the window was gone. The air felt colder. Maya swallowed hard, her breath quick and shallow, as she dared to look toward the window again. The curtains shifted once more. Maya's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched, her eyes locked on the faint outline of a figure standing inside. She couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. It was tall, unnaturally still, as if it was waiting for her to do something, anything. She tried to call out again, but her throat closed up. The figure didn't move. Not even a twitch. Her gaze locked with it, but she felt no comfort, no relief. The eyes, if they even were eyes, were dark, impossibly so, as if all the light around them had been sucked in, devoured by the very darkness that stood behind the glass. That was when the sound came. A sharp knock from the other side of the door, followed by a sudden jolt, as if something had violently struck the doorframe. Maya stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, as she heard a long, dragging sound, something scraping across the floor. It was moving closer, dragging itself through the house. The figure behind the window was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Maya's mind raced. She was terrified. Frozen. Every part of her screamed to run, but her feet refused to obey. And then, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was so thick, so oppressive, that Maya could almost taste it. And then, a voice, a harsh, guttural whisper, came from inside the house. It was low, rasping, a mocking parody of her mother's voice. "Maya, it's not safe. Get out." Her heart pounded as she spun toward the door, her mind reeling. Her hand reached for the handle again, pulling hard. But it was no use. The door remained locked, the cold metal mocking her. The voice continued, growing more desperate, more frantic. "Leave, Maya. Leave now, before it comes for you." But Maya couldn't leave. Not yet. With a sudden burst of courage, she banged on the door, shouting her mother's name once more. And then, from somewhere deep inside the house, came the most horrifying sound of all. A slow, deliberate, blood-curdling laugh. It wasn't her mom. It wasn't anyone she knew. And that laugh, the way it echoed through the house, wasn't something that should have belonged in her world. It wasn't human. Maya's world spun. The door rattled beneath her hand, as if it were alive, threatening to break free from its frame. She could feel the air growing colder, the walls closing in. Something was waiting. Something was watching. And just when she thought she could take no more, she heard it, the softest sound, barely perceptible, like a whisper in the air. "Maya, come inside." Her heart stopped. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the walls. Maya didn't dare to move. The whispering had stopped, but the dread it left behind lingered in the very marrow of her bones. Her hands trembled as she pulled them away from the door, trying to steady her breath, but nothing seemed to calm the storm raging inside her chest. The quiet, unnatural laughter she had heard was still echoing in her head, bouncing off the inside of her skull like a cruel reminder that she was not alone. She took a slow step back, her eyes never leaving the door, as if it might open on its own at any moment. Her fingers still ached from gripping the door handle so tightly. Each beat of her heart was like a thunderclap in the suffocating silence. Then, it came again. "Maya, come inside." The voice was low, strained, a rasp that seemed to claw its way from the very heart of the house, as though the walls themselves were breathing. It was faint, yet it carried with it an undeniable weight. Something unnatural, something ancient, rested behind it, seeping through every crack in the wood and every thread of air that brushed against her skin. The voice sounded almost familiar, yet it wasn't her mother's voice. It wasn't even human. Maya's stomach churned. She was shaking now, her feet rooted to the ground. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but something kept her there. Curiosity. Fear. A terrible combination of both. Her breath came faster, and her eyes darted around the street, as though hoping someone might appear to help. But the street was empty, bathed in the sterile glow of a flickering street lamp. The quiet was absolute. "Please," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't know who she was pleading to, her mother, the house, God. Whoever it was, the answer didn't come. The world around her felt too still, too empty. It was as though time itself had come to a grinding halt. And then, something moved behind her. Maya whipped around, her heart in her throat. There, just at the edge of her vision, she saw it, a shadow. It was tall, thin, stretching across the ground like a dark stain. It flickered and shifted, morphing in the moonlight like something alive. Something watching her. Her breath hitched in her chest, and she spun back toward the door. The feeling of eyes on her was suffocating. It's here. Without thinking, she lunged forward and pounded on the door again, desperate, her hands slick with sweat. Her knuckles ached from the force, but she didn't care. "Mom! Please! Open the door!" Her voice was raw now, filled with panic. Nothing. Not even a sound from inside. It was then that something inside Maya snapped. She couldn't explain why, but she couldn't just stand there anymore. Something was happening in that house. Something that was connected to her mother. Something that she could no longer ignore. With trembling hands, Maya turned the handle again, not caring how ridiculous it was. The lock resisted, but then, something gave way. The door creaked open, the dark interior of the house greeting her like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. The air inside was thick with dust, and a stale, bitter scent clung to the walls. It smelled wrong, unnatural. The once vibrant colors of the wallpaper had long since faded, peeling and curling at the edges. The house felt heavier than it ever had before, like it was alive, like it was watching her, waiting. Every creak of the floorboard seemed to reverberate through the silence, as though the house was alive, breathing with her. "Maya," the voice called again, softer this time, almost sweet. The whisper came from the hallway beyond, just out of her sight. Maya's pulse raced in her ears as she hesitated in the doorway. She couldn't see anything in the pitch-black hallway, but she knew something was there, something, waiting. "It's just a house," she told herself, "nothing is in here. Just Mom. You're just tired. It's nothing." But even as she thought it, her heart told her otherwise. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, that undeniable sense of being watched. Maya's feet felt like lead as she forced herself to step into the house. She crossed the threshold, the air growing colder the further she moved from the doorway. The house seemed to exhale as she entered, the floorboards groaning beneath her, a sickening echo in the silence. "Mom," she called softly, her voice trembling. She had to find her mother. She had to get her out of this place, away from whatever was haunting their home. The silence that answered her was crushing. Maya moved cautiously, one foot in front of the other, making her way through the darkened hallway. Her hand grazed the walls, her fingers brushing over the peeling wallpaper, the rough texture sending a shiver up her spine. The air felt colder, heavier with each step she took. Then, she heard it. A faint rustling, as if something was moving just beyond her line of sight. Her breath caught in her throat. "Mom," she whispered again, but the whisper didn't come from the other side of the house. It came from the walls. The soft, scraping sound echoed through the house, and for a brief moment, it sounded like a sob, muffled and distant. It was faint, but it chilled Maya to her core. The walls, they were alive. The very house was breathing, exhaling its sorrow in a language that no one could understand. Then, in the darkness ahead of her, a figure emerged. Maya gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The figure was tall, thin, its shape hard to define. It moved like liquid, stretching and writhing in the dim light, its form constantly shifting. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. It was something worse. Something that defied logic. It turned toward her, its eyes, hollow, dark pits that seemed to draw her in, pulling her toward it like a moth to a flame. It spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that vibrated through the very walls of the house. "Maya. I've been waiting for you." The words sent a jolt of cold through her veins. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. Her legs refused to move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing in front of her. Every instinct told her to run, to scream, but all she could do was stand there, paralyzed in the grip of its gaze. "I know what you're looking for," it hissed, its voice slithering into her ears. "But you'll never find her." The thing in front of her tilted its head, its eyes narrowing in a way that made Maya feel like she was suffocating. She could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on her, smothering her. It was the worst kind of terror, the kind that gnawed at her soul, that made her question everything she knew about the world. And then it smiled. A twisted, grotesque grin that stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. Maya took a step back, stumbling over her own feet, her heart racing, panic surging through her veins. She didn't know what it was, but she knew one thing for certain: it wasn't going to let her leave. Not until it had what it wanted. And for the first time in her life, Maya understood that the house had never been a home. It had been a trap. Maya's heart pounded as her legs finally responded to the overwhelming fear coursing through her veins. Her feet stumbled backward, one shaky step after the other, but the thing in front of her didn't move. It just stood there, its hollow eyes never leaving her. She could feel it, its gaze wrapping around her like a chain, holding her in place. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls creaking with a hunger that matched the thing's twisted smile. "Maya," it whispered again, the name dragging out like a promise of something horrible. Its voice reverberated in her skull, making it impossible to think, impossible to breathe. Her breath caught in her throat, and the panic rose like a tidal wave. This thing, this creature, wasn't just in the house, it was the house. The very walls, the floorboards, the ceiling, everything was connected to it. She realized, too late, that there had never been an escape. Her heart raced faster. She wasn't just trapped by the physical house, she was trapped in its curse, bound by its hunger. And then, before she could process it, the creature moved. It didn't lurch forward with a typical, monstrous gait. No, it shifted, the way a shadow stretches across the floor as the sun sets. It elongated, its limbs twisting like smoke in the dark, until it loomed over her. Its breath was cold, colder than the house itself, and the chill cut through her clothes, sinking straight to her bones. Maya gasped and turned to run. Her feet carried her forward, away from the creature, away from its suffocating presence. The house felt like it was alive, the floorboards buckling under her weight, the walls narrowing with every breath. She had to get out. She had to escape. But the house wasn't done with her yet. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing like thunder in the silent house. Her mind was racing, scrambling for a way out, a way to break free of whatever this place had become. Her fingers brushed against the peeling wallpaper, hoping to find some connection to the world outside, but everything felt so wrong. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they had a heartbeat of their own, a slow, thumping rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. And then, as she turned the corner, she stopped. The hallway stretched before her, longer than it should have been, darker than it had ever been. The light from the window had faded, swallowed by an inky darkness that poured from every corner, from every crack in the walls. Maya's eyes darted around, trying to find something, anything, that could make sense of this nightmare. But there was nothing. She was trapped. The sound of footsteps filled the air, slow and measured. They echoed in time with the beat of her own heart, growing louder and louder, until they were right behind her. She spun around, her chest tight, eyes searching, but there was nothing. No creature, no shadow, no movement. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. It was an oppressive weight, a pressure that she could feel pressing against her chest. Maya's breath came in shallow gasps. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, touching the wall next to her for support. Her fingers brushed against something slick, something wet. She pulled her hand back, but not before she saw the crimson streaks left behind on her skin. Her stomach churned. The blood. The walls were bleeding. The house itself was bleeding. Her eyes widened, and her pulse quickened as she backed away, her heels scraping against the floor. The dark liquid dripped down the wall, pooling at the baseboards like a flood, slow and deliberate. The air grew thicker, the smell of iron and rot overwhelming. She could feel it in the back of her throat, a metallic taste that made her gag. And then, again, the voice. Maya, it crooned from the darkness, its tone soft and inviting, yet full of malice. It echoed from every direction, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. The walls. The floor. The ceiling. The voice was everywhere. With a sharp breath, Maya spun and ran, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. She sprinted down the hall, her hands reaching out to touch the walls for guidance, but the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly before her. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay. She couldn't stop. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, warping and twisting like it had a life of its own. The walls closed in, narrowing the path ahead, forcing her to turn to the left. The sharp, broken edges of the walls scraped against her arms as she ran, but she didn't care. Her only thought was to get out. But then, something unexpected happened. She reached an open door. It was wide, the faintest light spilling from the crack beneath it. Maya hesitated for a moment, her breath shallow, but then she pushed forward, throwing the door open with all her strength. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. She stepped into the room, her shoes sinking into something soft underfoot. The light was dim, coming from an old, flickering lamp on the far side of the room. The room was small, almost suffocatingly so, with walls that felt too close, too claustrophobic. But what caught her attention wasn't the room. It was the figure standing in the corner. It was her mother. Maya's heart skipped a beat, relief flooding her chest for a fleeting second. She rushed toward her, calling out her name. Mom! Her voice cracked, the words coming out in a desperate rush. But as she neared her mother, she stopped. Her mother didn't move. She stood in the corner, still as stone, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no light behind them. They were empty, hollow sockets. She was standing, yes, but it wasn't her. It wasn't her at all. Maya's blood ran cold as she realized what she was looking at. It was a mannequin. A mannequin dressed in her mother's clothes, her mother's face staring back at her from the empty void of those hollow eyes. Maya stumbled back, her heart thundering in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on her again, but this time, the suffocating pressure was worse. It was worse because she knew it was only the beginning. Whatever this house was, whatever had taken her mother, it was toying with her now. It was toying with her mind. She turned around, her body shaking with terror, but the door was gone. The hallway was gone. The walls were closing in, pressing against her from all sides, the floor buckling beneath her feet. And then, through the darkness, came the laugh. It wasn't her mother's laugh. It wasn't even the creature's laugh. It was her own. It was coming from everywhere. It was coming from inside her head. And it wouldn't stop. Maya didn't know how long she had been standing there, her body frozen in place, staring at the mannequin that was supposed to be her mother. The dim light from the flickering lamp cast long, distorted shadows across the room, but all she could see was the thing in front of her, the empty, lifeless mannequin with her mother's face. The laughter still echoed in her mind, a cruel, mocking sound that seemed to stretch across time. Her own laughter, but twisted, distorted, as if someone, or something, was imitating her from within her mind, replaying her fear and desperation over and over. She could almost feel it inside her skull, gnawing at her thoughts, warping her perception of reality. Maya shook her head violently, as if to force the laughter out of her ears. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let the house claim her mind the way it had claimed her mother. It's not real, she thought. It's just a trick. A hallucination. It's not real. But the longer she stood there, the more the lines between reality and nightmare began to blur. The mannequin, the thing dressed in her mother's clothes, seemed to shift in the light, its face contorting into an expression of horror that mirrored Maya's own. Its empty eyes stared at her, unblinking, mocking her with the same cold detachment that had haunted her since she first stepped into the house. She took a step back, her feet moving against her will, until her back hit the wall. The walls seemed to close in around her, their surfaces warping, breathing. Maya's mind raced, and her breath came in ragged gasps. The suffocating air felt thick, like she was drowning in it. The laughter still rang in her ears, a constant drumbeat of madness. Then, a sound from behind her. A creak. Maya froze. Her heart stopped in her chest. She dared not move, her eyes darting to the corners of the room, trying to catch any movement. The creak came again, followed by a slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. No. Her mind screamed. No, not again. She turned, and this time, the darkness didn't let her escape. The room had shifted in a second. She had been frozen in place. The walls were now covered in long, dark streaks, as if someone, or something, had smeared blood across them. The floor beneath her feet groaned, and in the corner of the room, near the doorway, a figure was crouched down, hidden in shadow. Its shape was indistinct, but Maya could feel its eyes on her. It's here. It's not real. It's not real. The figure shifted slightly, its limbs contorting unnaturally as it stood up. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its throat, so deep and resonant that it made the room vibrate. Maya could feel the presence behind her like a force pressing against her, suffocating her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The thing in the corner stepped forward, its face emerging from the darkness. It was human, or at least it had been once. But now, it was a twisted mockery of humanity, its skin pale and stretched too tight, its mouth a grotesque, unnatural grin that split its face open in a sickening way. The eyes were the worst part, though. They were too wide, too empty, as if it had never truly been alive. Maya, the voice rasped from its throat, though the words were choked with something far worse than mere malice. They were cold. Dead. And yet, they carried the same familiarity as the voice of the thing that had called her name in the hallway. The thing reached out a hand, its fingers elongated and twitching. "Come closer," it whispered. "I'm waiting for you." Maya's mind screamed at her to run. She had to run. She had to leave before it caught her, before it dragged her into the hell she was slowly sinking into. But her feet wouldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing. Her body was paralyzed with fear, her limbs frozen in place as it came closer, the sound of its footsteps thudding against the floor in slow, deliberate steps. The closer it got, the more she felt the temperature drop. The cold seeped into her skin, her muscles stiffening with each step it took toward her. The air was thick with something foul, something rotting, and Maya's stomach turned violently. The room was no longer just a place, it was a trap. She had to get out. With all her strength, Maya forced her legs to move, her arms flailing as she bolted for the door. She felt the icy fingers of the creature graze her shoulder as she passed it, a burning coldness that left a mark, like its touch was imprinted on her very skin. But when she reached the doorway, she stopped. The door wasn't there anymore. Where the door had once been, there was nothing but a wall, its surface smooth and impenetrable. Maya's breath came in frantic gasps as she turned in circles, her chest tightening, her head spinning. She had to get out. She had to. "Don't run," the thing whispered from behind her. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. "It's in my head," she thought. "It's in my head." But the walls around her were no longer just walls. The house had changed. The rooms had shifted. The hallways, once familiar, were now filled with twisting corridors, leading nowhere, everything in the house connected by that same crushing, suffocating air. Maya, the voice came again, this time from every direction. It was all around her, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I've been waiting for you. Her mind was racing, her thoughts spiraling into chaos as the house pressed in around her. She reached out for the walls, her fingers brushing against the rough surface, her nails scraping against something wet and sticky. She pulled her hand back and saw that it was covered in blood. Her own blood. But she hadn't been hurt. Not physically. It's inside me. Her mind screamed. It's inside me. In the distance, she heard the sound of footsteps again, but they weren't coming from the creature. They weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from outside. For a moment, Maya thought she might be losing her mind. Her vision blurred as she stumbled toward the only source of light, the flickering lamp. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the edge of the light. For a split second, she thought she saw something, someone, standing in the light. A face. A figure. But it was gone before she could focus on it. The walls closed in tighter. And then, without warning, the house let out a low groan, its floors creaking as if shifting in response to her presence. The floor beneath her feet began to shake violently, the walls warping and bending. The house was alive. And it wanted her. She was sure of it now. The house didn't want to let her go. It wanted to keep her here, to twist her mind into madness, to pull her into the dark, twisted web that had been woven around her since the moment she set foot inside. With every second, she could feel herself losing grip on reality. The walls were closing in. Her vision was clouded. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't escape. But then, through the overwhelming noise and chaos, she heard it again. Maya. This time, it was different. This time, the voice was familiar. It wasn't the creature's voice. It wasn't the mocking, distorted whispers. It was her mother's voice. Maya, I'm here. A flicker of hope stirred in Maya's chest, and for the briefest moment, she dared to believe it. She dared to think that maybe, just maybe, her mother was still alive. That she had found her. But as the voice continued, her blood ran cold. I'm here, Maya. Come to me. It was then that Maya understood. The house wasn't just trapping her. It was trapping them. Maya stumbled through the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest like a drumbeat. Her legs were numb, each step feeling like it was sinking deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape. The walls around her seemed to pulse, contracting and expanding as though they were alive, breathing with the same hunger that had chased her since she first stepped into the house. She wanted to scream, to tear her way through the suffocating silence, but each time she opened her mouth, no sound came out. It was as if the very air in the house had swallowed her voice whole. The silence was absolute, and in that silence, the house itself seemed to speak to her, its whispers crawling into her mind, spreading like poison. Maya, her name came again, softer now, as though it was luring her. Her mother's voice. She could hear it clearly, unmistakable, but warped. Twisted. It sounded close, but she knew better than to trust her ears. She'd been tricked before. The house was playing with her. As she moved down the hallway, the walls around her seemed to shift. The flickering light from the lamp at the end of the corridor cast long, grotesque shadows that twisted and danced as if alive. Her eyes darted nervously, searching the corners for any sign of movement. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she tried to calm her racing heart. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Slow, deliberate, each step perfectly timed with her own. Maya stopped. The air around her was thick with a feeling of impending dread, as if something was about to happen, something she couldn't control. The footsteps stopped too. Is someone behind me? Her pulse quickened as she spun around, but the hallway was empty. Nothing was there. No one was there. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her, waiting. The faint glow from the lamp at the end of the hall flickered again, and for the briefest moment, Maya saw something in the reflection of the darkened hallway, a face, pale and distorted, with wide, vacant eyes. It was just a glimpse, a fleeting shadow of a face, but it was enough to freeze her in place. It was a woman's face. Her mother. But the face didn't belong to the woman she remembered. This face was hollow, its skin stretched too tight, its eyes wide with fear. The lips were twisted into a silent scream, as though begging for help. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned and bolted, her feet carrying her forward in a desperate rush. She had to get out. She had to. Bang! The sound echoed through the house, so loud it nearly deafened her. It came from behind her, from the far end of the hallway. She couldn't stop herself, her instincts took over, and she sprinted toward the sound, as if it could lead her to safety. But when she reached the source of the noise, all she found was another door. The door was old, wooden, its edges worn and splintered. It looked like it had been there for centuries, a relic of the house's twisted history. And yet, there was something about it that drew her in, something that made her feel like she needed to open it, like she had no choice. Maya hesitated, her hand trembling as it hovered over the doorknob. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to leave, to find another way out, but her feet were already moving forward. She could feel it, a force, a compulsion that she couldn't fight. She had to open it. With a deep breath, she twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything she had seen before. It was a sitting room of sorts, but it was not like the others in the house. This one was immaculate, too immaculate. The furniture was covered in dust, the curtains drawn tight against the outside world. The air was heavy with an oppressive stillness, as if time itself had stopped within these four walls. And yet, as Maya stepped inside, something about the room felt wrong. It was as though the very air itself was thick with the weight of untold secrets. She took another step, and then another, her eyes scanning the room. In the far corner, there was a large portrait hanging on the wall. It was a family portrait, but the faces of the people in the painting were obscured by a thick layer of black grime. Only their eyes were visible, wide, hollow, empty. Maya's stomach churned. She wanted to look away, but something kept her eyes locked on the faces in the painting. Their eyes followed her, moving with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible. They were watching her, just like the house had been watching her. She could feel them. Maya's hand shot out toward the portrait, almost involuntarily. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, cracked frame. The moment her skin made contact, a sharp pain shot up her arm, and she yanked her hand back in shock. The room suddenly felt colder, darker. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching across the floor like dark fingers, reaching for her. Her pulse spiked as she spun around, but there was no escaping the feeling of being trapped. Something wasn't right. "Help me," the voice came again. Soft, desperate, and unmistakably her mother's voice. Maya's heart skipped a beat, and her breath hitched in her chest. She turned toward the sound, but the room was empty. The walls closed in around her, and she felt a sense of dread rising in her chest, as if the house itself was feeding off her fear. It's not real. She had to remind herself. It's just the house playing with my mind. It's not real. But as she backed away from the portrait, the floor beneath her feet creaked, and then, something shifted. A door on the far wall opened with a loud groan, revealing a long, narrow staircase descending into the darkness below. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the stairs. The air was thick with a heavy sense of foreboding. She couldn't explain it, but everything inside her screamed to run. The voice, the painting, the shadows, all of it was pushing her in this direction. And despite the fear that gripped her chest, she felt an undeniable pull to go down. She didn't want to. She didn't want to follow that pull, to descend further into the house's nightmare. But something deep within her, a part of her that she didn't understand, whispered that this was the only way. Taking a deep breath, Maya stepped toward the stairs, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick silence in the house. With each step she took, the air grew colder, the darkness heavier. The walls seemed to close in around her as she descended, the faint echo of her own breathing the only sound that accompanied her. At the bottom of the stairs, there was another door, this one ancient, covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift when she looked at them. The door felt wrong, like it had been waiting for her to find it. Waiting for her to open it. She reached for the handle, her heart hammering in her chest, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, flickering light. But this room was different. There were no walls. There was no ceiling. Just a vast, empty space stretching out before her, an endless void, as if the house itself had given way to nothingness. In the center of the room, there was a chair. And in that chair, someone was sitting. Her mother. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she rushed forward. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own racing heart. But her mother didn't respond. Her eyes were wide open, but lifeless. There was no recognition in them, no sign that she knew Maya had come for her. The woman's mouth opened in a silent scream, as if trapped in some nightmare, but the sound never escaped. The room was so cold now, colder than it had ever been. And as Maya looked around, the darkness seemed to close in, swallowing everything, until all she could see was her mother's face. The door slammed shut behind her. And that was when Maya realized. She wasn't alone anymore. The house had claimed her. Maya's pulse raced as she stood frozen in the vast, empty room, her eyes locked onto the still figure in the chair. Her mother, or what was left of her, sat there motionless, her once familiar face contorted in a silent scream, her eyes wide and vacant. Maya's breath caught in her throat, and her fingers clenched into fists, as if trying to stop the trembling that had taken over her entire body. The darkness around her seemed to pulse with an energy that was almost alive. It was suffocating, thick with dread, and it wrapped itself around her like a vice. Every breath felt like a struggle, the air heavy with something foul, something ancient. She took a step forward, her legs feeling like they might give way beneath her. Her mind screamed at her to turn around and run, to flee back up the stairs, but her body refused to obey. She couldn't tear her gaze away from her mother's lifeless form, nor from the oppressive emptiness that surrounded her. "Mom," she whispered again, her voice trembling. The woman in the chair didn't respond. There was no recognition in her eyes, no sign that she even knew Maya was there. The figure before her was hollow, empty, a twisted version of the mother she had once known. Maya reached out a trembling hand toward her, but as her fingers neared the air around her mother, an icy coldness rushed through her veins. The temperature dropped sharply, and Maya staggered back, her chest tightening as if something had wrapped around her heart. She gasped for air, but no matter how hard she tried to breathe, the suffocating weight of the room kept her trapped. It was then that she noticed something small and terrifying, creeping out from the corners of the room. At first, it was just a flicker in the shadows, a movement too quick to catch, too fleeting to understand. But then, they started to appear more clearly, crawling across the floor like spiders from the darkest depths of her nightmare. They were eyes. Hundreds of them. All of them staring, blinking in unison, all watching her with an intensity that sent ice through her bones. The eyes were everywhere, in the corners, in the shadows, on the walls, and they seemed to be closing in on her, tracking her every movement. Maya's heart thudded against her ribs as she spun around, looking for an escape, but there was none. The room was a prison, the walls stretching and shifting in ways that defied logic. No matter how many steps she took, she never seemed to reach the edge. The eyes followed her, relentless, as though they were pulling her deeper into the nightmare. With every step, the shadows grew darker. The walls seemed to close in, and the ceiling disappeared entirely, leaving only an endless, suffocating blackness above her. The eyes multiplied, their gaze growing more intense, more focused, until it felt like they were tearing through her very soul. She could hear their whispers now, low and unintelligible, like a chant coming from every direction at once. Maya. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was her mother's voice again, but it was different this time. It wasn't the soft, comforting voice of the woman who had once held her in her arms. It was cold. Hollow. The voice of something not quite human. Maya's breath caught in her throat, and her legs began to shake. She wanted to run, to escape, but the weight of the room seemed to hold her in place. The whispers grew louder, the eyes more numerous, until the whole world seemed to be pressing in on her. Maya, come closer. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, and Maya's heart lurched in her chest. It was calling her. It was begging her to come closer. Without thinking, her feet began to move. She couldn't stop herself. Her body was no longer under her control. It was as though something inside her was guiding her toward the chair, toward the figure of her mother. The room swirled around her, the walls bending and shifting in ways that made her dizzy, but her legs moved forward, carrying her deeper into the nightmare. Each step felt like an eternity. The eyes grew more intense, their unblinking stare filling her mind, tearing through her thoughts. The whispers became louder, clearer, until they were no longer just words. They were demands. Come to me. Her mother's face in the chair seemed to be distorting, her features becoming more grotesque with each passing second. Her lips curled into a sickening smile, one that didn't belong to a mother, but to something far darker. Her eyes no longer looked vacant, they glowed with a fiery intensity that burned into Maya's soul. She stumbled forward, her body moving against her will, her hands reaching out toward her mother's cold, lifeless form. The moment her fingers brushed against her mother's skin, a shockwave of cold ran through her, seizing her chest in an icy grip. It felt like the very essence of the house was coursing through her veins. It was suffocating. Consuming. Her mother's eyes snapped open, but they were no longer her mother's eyes. They were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. And as they fixed on Maya, they began to twist, their pupils stretching and warping into shapes that made her stomach churn. Maya, you've come. The voice was no longer her mother's. It was something else entirely. It was a low, guttural growl that reverberated in her bones, something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting for her. The room began to close in on her, the walls distorting, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes that lurked in the corners of her vision. The eyes multiplied, crawling over the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, until the room was filled with thousands of them, all watching, all waiting. And then, the voice whispered again, this time with a strange, twisted glee. You're mine now. Maya's heart froze in her chest, the words echoing in her mind like a death knell. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air had become thick, almost liquid, suffocating her. Her vision blurred, and the world around her spun out of control. The figure in the chair stood up, its form shifting and contorting in the flickering light, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. It was no longer her mother. It was something far worse, something made of shadow and darkness, something that had taken the form of her mother but was twisted beyond recognition. Its hand reached toward her, its fingers stretching unnaturally long, each one tipped with jagged nails that scraped across the floor like claws. It moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. And when it touched her, she felt a coldness unlike anything she had ever experienced, a coldness that seeped into her bones, into her very soul. The world around her went black. When Maya opened her eyes, she was no longer in the room. She was standing in the middle of an endless void, surrounded by nothing but darkness. Her body felt weightless, as though she was suspended in mid-air, unable to move. There was no sound. No light. Only the crushing silence. Maya. The voice was close now, right beside her, and this time it wasn't coming from any direction. It was coming from inside her mind. And then, she realized the truth. There was no escape. She had been here all along. The house had taken her. And there was no way out. The hollow place was her prison now. Maya awoke in a place she didn't recognize, or rather, she was no longer sure if she even recognized anything anymore. The air was thick, cold, and smelled of rot. It pressed in around her, heavy and suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was alive. She felt weightless, but somehow grounded, as if every step she took was tethered to something dark, something that did not want her to leave. The room was the same one she had seen before, the one with the endless blackness, the one that felt like it was consuming her. But now, it was different. The walls had become transparent, showing her strange, twisted glimpses of other places, other rooms. Each was just as dark, just as suffocating, but they all felt connected. Connected by a thread. A thread that was pulling her deeper into this nightmare, tightening with every breath. She could still feel it, the presence. It was in the air, in her bones, crawling beneath her skin like something scratching its way out. She reached for her neck, feeling the cold sweat that clung to her skin, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something move behind her, just out of the corner of her eye. But when she turned, there was nothing. The house had always been full of nothing. But now, Maya was beginning to understand that nothing was far more dangerous than anything else. There was a whisper in the distance, low and familiar, just like the voice of her mother, but this time it didn't sound like a cry for help. It wasn't pleading, like it had been before. This time, it was different. It was welcoming. Maya. She turned, her breath caught in her throat. She had no choice. She couldn't fight it anymore. The house had its hold on her. And as much as she wanted to turn and flee, there was nowhere to go. The air around her grew colder still. Her vision blurred as her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her deeper into the house. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what awaited her, but it didn't matter anymore. She was going to find out. The house had promised her that much. As she moved, her feet sinking into the dark, rotting wood beneath her, the whispers grew louder. They circled her, wrapped around her like a blanket of terror. Her heart began to race once more. The shadows, the eyes, everything she had seen before, all of it was closing in again. And this time, she was powerless to stop it. She reached a door. One that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Her hand shot out, trembling, as though it was no longer her own. Her fingers brushed against the cold, splintered wood, and the moment she touched it, the door creaked open on its own, the hinges groaning as if it hadn't been touched in centuries. Inside was nothing. But everything was there, too. The darkness pressed in like a living thing, wrapping around her like a cocoon. The room was vast, endless, stretching beyond what her mind could comprehend. At its center, there was a single object, a mirror. Maya stepped forward, drawn to it, the pull too strong to resist. When she peered into the mirror, she didn't see herself. Instead, she saw the house. The whole house. The twisted, broken structure that had become her prison. Every room, every shadow, every creaking floorboard, it was all reflected in the mirror, but it was not a reflection. No. It was something else. Something alive. In the glass, the house seemed to breathe, to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. It moved, it shifted, and as she stared into it, the house began to change. The rooms, the walls, the ceiling, they twisted and contorted, as though they were being pulled apart by invisible hands. The very fabric of the house was unraveling, and as it did, it revealed something far more horrifying than Maya could have imagined. Behind the house, there was another space. A place beneath the house. A void. A black hole, a gaping maw that seemed to stretch on forever, pulling everything into it, consuming it. And then, Maya saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the void, staring directly at her through the mirror. It was a woman. Her mother. But again, it wasn't really her. The face was twisted, the eyes wide open and black, unblinking, like an abyss staring back at her. Maya. The voice was her mother's, but it was different. Hollow. Empty. And yet, there was something so compelling about it. Something that made her want to step closer to the mirror, to let it swallow her whole. Come to me, Maya. It's time. The words echoed in her mind, vibrating through her skull, wrapping themselves around her thoughts, around her very being. It's time. Maya didn't understand what that meant. But she could feel it. She could feel the pull, the call. It was like something deep inside her had been awakened, something that had been dormant, waiting for this moment. The house had been waiting for her. She didn't want to do it. She didn't want to give in, to walk toward the mirror, toward her mother's twisted form. But something inside her needed to. She had no choice. The house had its claws in her, and no matter how hard she tried to fight, no matter how much she wanted to run, she couldn't. Her body moved without her consent, one step after another, until she was standing directly in front of the mirror, her hand outstretched toward the cold glass. She touched it. And as her fingers made contact with the surface, the mirror shattered. Not in the way she expected. The shards didn't fall. They ripped. They tore through the air like blades, slicing through her skin, through her body, and before she could even scream, they were inside her, sinking into her flesh like needles. She could feel them, each one cutting deeper, each one pulling her into the very heart of the house. The world around her spun. The house shifted again, its walls folding into themselves, closing in on her. The shadows became tangible, reaching for her with twisted, gnarled hands. They clawed at her, pulling her deeper into the heart of the house, where she could feel the truth of it all. The house was alive. It had always been alive. And it had always wanted her. As the shards of glass continued to pierce her skin, Maya realized the horrifying truth. The house wasn't just a place. It was a being. A creature that had been feeding on fear for centuries, growing stronger with every soul it claimed. Maya was its final victim. And now, there was no escape. No one would ever find her. She would fade into the darkness, become part of the house, just like every other lost soul who had come before her. Her body crumbled, the darkness consuming her whole, and as she disappeared into the void, the final whisper came, softer than ever. Welcome home. And with that, the house claimed its last soul. And it waited for the next.